What I want to look at today is, at least in this part, is the issue of bias. This is something that usually isn't brought up in intro classes. You'll frequently see it in, say, usually actually in graduate level classes in majors, but it really belongs here because you have to understand that the Western academic tradition, and in geography in particular, has a number of, in some cases, pretty subtle, but in other cases, they're pretty not subtle biases underlie the assumptions, and especially the writings and then points of view that were true in the past and actually still persist into the present. And you have to remember that bias just means that you have something that shapes the way you make choices or the way that you view things. Bias isn't necessarily bad. I would argue that bias is worse when you don't know that you have it or you don't accept that you're biased. And at least from an anthropological and also geographic perspective, anyone that says they aren't biased has not got a grasp of reality. So if someone says, "Oh, I'm not biased," I would immediately just sort of walk from that person and not listen to them because their sense of who they are is really out of touch with the way they view the world around them. Anywho, so let's look at some of these sort of real basic biases that underlie Western thought. Now, the reason these are real critical is they're not universal. In other words, these aren't human things. These are the Western intellectual tradition stuff coming out of the Judeo-Christian system, Western Europe, which is, of course, the academic system we're in. So these are a set of concepts that underlie the educational system that you're in here at Chaminade. First is ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is a pretty standard response because when you really get down to it, ethnocentrism is the way of defining the world in terms of us versus everyone else. And human behavior and human perception being what it is, us is invariably considered different and distinct from everyone else, otherwise it wouldn't be a group. For what we can tell, our relative, the other primates around us, like baboons and stuff, have exactly the same sort of attitudes. The Greeks were the first ones to really sort of formalize this. Now you have to remember when we talk about Greek, even that's sort of bizarre because to the Greeks, ethnocentrism actually was at the level of the city. So if you were from the city of Athens, you thought folks from the city of Thebes or Corinth or Sparta, other Greek cities, were barbarians. And your ethnocentrism then would literally be the equivalent of, like, say, Pearl City or like Pahu or something like that. It wasn't the folks that shared a common language or shared a large region or something like that. It was really a very specific space. And the Greek view of the rest of the world was, in fact, that in Greek, I can't remember what the Greek word for the English version of the Greek is, barbarous. I don't remember what it is in actual Greek. But the idea that folks that are different than you are, one, generally lesser than you. In other words, you're the pinnacle of success and style and whatever. But also you're going to look at these other groups from your own framework. So if you're Greek and you're Herodotus, one of the great Greek historian geographers, you're looking at the guys further north who are nomadic and ride horses all the time. And you're going to look at them from the Greek standpoint, which is just people don't do that. People don't ride horses all the time. People aren't comfortable on horseback, particularly. People walk, and real guys walk, and real warriors fight on foot. And so when he sees these folks to the north, many of them called Scythians, for example, though they'd also be called Huns, he's going to see them from the standpoint of judging them in terms of the way that they should operate, which of course is from the Greek point of view. And from these stories of the guys to the north that ride horses all the time, you end up with the idea of the centaur, the half man, half horse, because the Greeks just couldn't visualize people who were regular people that would be on horseback all the time. So they make them into something else. This is the idea of ethnocentrism. You judge others from the standpoint or framework of your own point of reference, i.e. your own group, your own set of values, your own worldview. Everyone does this. I would argue to some extent this is probably sort of innate with the idea of group bonding, because if a group isn't special, it's not really a group. But ethnocentrism is the way we operate, and everyone's ethnocentric. There was an argument when social media and the internet really became big about 10 years ago that was going to break down ethnocentrism, because now people could be exposed to, another, say, in the case of Facebook, 2 billion people on the planet, almost 40% of the world's population is on Facebook. So therefore, people thought naively it'd be really hard to be ethnocentric. The world you live in, I think, in 2021, if anything, people are actually more ethnocentric. So what's happened is exposure to others, exposure to social media, the internet, and everything, hasn't made people more accepting of others. If anything, as far as we can tell, it's actually pushed people inward so they become much more sort of aggro about, this is our boundaries, this is who we are, and no one else need apply, and you guys are all weird, that type of thing. So ethnocentrism is a very basic apparent response to group membership, group identity, group valuation, and the other. And as I mentioned, everyone's ethnocentric. So the key here is you can't get rid of being ethnocentric. What you want to be, if you're an anthropologist, or especially in this case, a human geographer, is you want to be aware of your ethnocentrism, be sensitized to it, be aware when it's affecting your judgments. So for example, if you're in China, you see Chinese doing something, if you immediately respond like, oh, that's really weird, real people wouldn't do that, that's an ethnocentric response from, say, an American or Canadian point of view. You can still think, I don't understand it. If it's something like food, you say, I don't like it. But the awareness that your own background is making that judgment call is the sensitivity to deal with ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is a part of our makeup. We're all ethnocentric. If I go back to Hong Kong, my wife loves the stinky tofu, and she loves what look to me like giant cockroach water beetles that they eat for snacks. Both of those, I'm sort of like, nah, I don't think so. On the other hand, there's some stuff that I eat from my background that she just thinks is totally grotesque. And the fact that you have these almost, your stomach, you can literally throw up when you see this stuff, is ethnocentrism. That's not a human response. The human species can eat all that stuff. The fact that you can't handle it is by virtue of your upbringing, values, and attitudes, and all that other stuff. Ethnocentrism, a very, very powerful concept, very, very powerful force in the way that people view themselves and others. It's one of the main ways that people filter their view of the world around them. So just be aware of it. In the Western theoretical tradition, what you might call a scientific or academic tradition, there's actually sort of, 3.5 really basic concepts that are very biased in the sense that they reflect the background of the Western academic tradition. It's important to remember, despite this whole sort of current discussion, the distinction between science and religion, that the Western scientific tradition comes out of religion. It comes out of Catholicism, comes out of largely Jesuits and other religious orders. So the Western intellectual scientific tradition has sort of buried in its foundations a set of religious logics that underlie Judeo-Christian thought. And what that means is these particular logics are not subject to testing validation. They're just accepted as the way the world is. And then you get on with doing, a chemistry experiment or something like that. But the reality is that they are biases in the sense that there's evidence to show that they're probably true, at least some of them. But there's evidence in the case of others to show that they're probably, not particularly true. So let's go through them really quickly. First one is really cool just because it's a really long word, and these always sound really impressive. And this is uniformitarianism. If you break it down, if you think of something that's uniform, something that's uniform is, like everyone dressed in the same uniform. So it's basically uniformitarianism is the idea that everything works the same way. And this comes out, of course, the whole sort of creation logic of Judeo-Christian thought, which is God makes the world and everything in it in, I think, 7 days or something like that. And what that would also mean is everything applies the same way all the time, every place. So, for example, water always flows downhill. Things always happen the same way. And that would be the idea of uniformitarian principles. Now, of course, centralized Western thought to a huge extent, the idea that you do a chemistry experiment, and if you use the same chemicals, you should get exactly the same result as someone, 100 years ago who did the same experiment with the same chemicals. The idea that the chemicals will always react in the same way. That's uniformitarianism. Now, at some level, deal with chemicals and, say erosion processes and stuff, that's, as far as we know, it's accurate. But then you have to remember this gets applied to everything. So it just becomes like a 360-degree blanket over everything. It has uniform principles. That becomes a lot more sketchy. And I should also point out that basic things like water flows downhill isn't necessarily seen that way by a lot of other populations. In Asia, certainly here in the Pacific, and from my background, Native American background, there are places where water flows uphill. So the idea that things always happen the same way is very much part of this Judeo-Christian or Western theoretical thought. It's not something that the rest of the population of the planet buys into. In the Asian traditions and Pacific Island traditions and in Native American traditions, there is no principle of uniformitarianism. There isn't the assumption that everything's the same. And if you think about it, what that means, for example, if you're a Polynesian going to a new island, if you're in a canoe and it's a settlement canoe, you're going to a new island, you don't assume that the new island is going to, where things are going to work the same way as at home. So the stress of moving becomes radically more when, you know, you might be in some place where water flows up through, when trees grow upside down. I mean, I don't know what it would be, but there's no concept of uniformity. That's a very Western concept. Okay, the second one is evolution. And this, of course, is one of the big, you know, spins of the 19th century, Darwin, Spencer, and all those guys. The key here is not so much that evolution occurs, there's God knows enough evidence of it, but is the fact that it's unilinear. And this is the idea that evolution occurs sort of like a train track. You start at something more primitive, it goes through time and it gets more complicated, more complex, and more sort of refined and specialized. When you're looking at, for example, a lot of physical species, animals and plants, that appears to be true. And of course, Hawaii is sort of the classic example of that, within highly specialized plants and especially animals that came in and over time went through evolutionary processes to become, you know, hyper specialized, where they would only eat the nectar out of one type of tree, for example. The trick is when you apply that to universally, again, as with uniformitarianism, when you apply that to everything, that everything goes through this process. So, for example, in the Western concept, we see this hugely in the United States, that if you have a product over time, you should improve it. So the idea that somehow even products, whether it be soap or something else, should evolve. The computer programs should evolve. That you educationally should evolve. So this idea of this principle of going from more generalized or more basic, or if you would, primitive, to more specialized, basically is used to basically judge and basically evaluate everything in the Western tradition. And to a certain extent, it justifies going to university is based on this premise when you think about it. And that doesn't have any evidence to support. That's just a ethos logic that's the basics of Western thought. And again, not part of other intellectual traditions. It's a peculiarly Euro-American, Western, you know, intellectual tradition thing. One of the spin-offs of this then, and this is the one that becomes more deadly in many ways, is the idea of social evolution, where you basically, going back to ethnocentrism, you look at that group of guys to the north running around on horseback, for example, if you're Greek, and what you do is you assume, well, you know, they must have never evolved, because if they actually were more evolved, they become more specialized, more sophisticated, more civilized, and they wouldn't be running around on horseback anymore. They'd have Greek temples, they'd have a Parthenon, they'd have a city like Athens and stuff like that, and then they would be civilized, real people. So what you do is you take groups of people and their passage through time, or even their existence right now, and you score them. Now, almost invariably, since the, you know, what you're going to use as a ranking is going to be based on your group being the best, is that this will vary tremendously. The logic of empires, for example, the British colonial empire of the 19th century was based almost entirely on social evolution. The British saw themselves as the most evolved, most technically, you know, technologically civilized, superior population in Victorian England, and it sort of was their obligation to control large parts of the rest of the planet and bring them up to the same level of civilization, et cetera, that the Brits had. And so therefore, if you're, you know, in control as they were of all of India, you don't see the Indians as being equivalent to you, because at some point, you know, if all people, given the Judeo-Christian logic, if all people started in the same place, so it's just like, you know, running a marathon, and the gun goes off and everyone starts. Now the Brits would see themselves, of course, being in the lead, way in the lead. They'd see the Indians as really lagging behind. And so therefore, the Indians are never going to be as good as the Brits. Yeah, you can give them the same civilization, the same training, but they don't have the same motivation or whatever logic you want to use. The Indians are always going to be a poor second to the Brits. That's the idea of social evolution. It's a huge part of American perception of other groups, even groups in the United States. It's a huge part of foreign policy for most governments. The French see themselves as more evolved than Americans. The Germans, God knows, they see themselves more evolved than the French and the Americans. So this idea that you stereotype others with this proviso that everyone starts at the same point. So if someone's as good as you, they should be up there with you. They shouldn't be lagging behind. And the fact that you're ahead, if you would, winning the race, means that you're somehow superior. And therefore, everyone else that you're talking about that isn't there is inferior. That's the really terrifying part of social evolution. It's not just an intellectual concept. It's the way we deal with other groups. It's invariably in a very negative, almost invariably in a very negative stereotypic response. Again, social evolution is not part of other traditions. Polynesians had no concept of social evolution. Asians had no concept of social evolution. Chinese thought they were superior, but they thought they were superior by virtue of where they were, and basically everyone else was just like whatever, or they really didn't care particularly. So they didn't score people that way. That's a peculiarly Western, Western tradition. The last of these very quickly is this psychic unity, and this is the most problematic of the bunch. If you have this idea of evolution, that God makes everything, and of course makes everyone at one bang in time. So you have Adam and Eve, in the Garden of Eden, and there's the snake and the apple tree and all the rest of that stuff. Then everyone is descended from Adam and Eve, which is the Judeo-Christian logic. I should point out Muslim also. Then in that concept, what you have is everyone is basically sort of a copy of each other. We're all not quite clones, if you would, or slightly modified clones. Therefore, because we're all basically almost exactly the same, there's a premise that everyone's brain works the same way. Now, this means the brain functions the same way. We perceive the world around us in the same way. Our senses work in the same way. So we call this concept is called psychic unity. And since a psyche or anything related to brain or brain interpretation is the same. So it's a form of this unilinear evolution when you think about it. And also uniformitarianism. That brain processes are the same regardless of who you are, where you are, to a certain extent, even when you were. This underlies, of course, psychology. The discipline of psychology would be in real trouble if you didn't have a concept of psychic unity, which is also why psychology is not a particularly popular discipline, for example, in Asia, because in Asian traditions, there is no concept of psychic unity. And you see this in all sorts of interesting ways, not the least of which is social etiquette. In Asian societies, since you don't have an attitude that everyone sees the world the same way you do, it's sort of like someone you don't know is almost like an alien. You don't know how they're seeing the world around them. You don't know how they relate to the world around them. And so you go through very formalized etiquette till you can figure out how much like you they are. Okay. In the Western tradition, since everyone's supposed to be exactly the same, you can actually rank people. This would be, of course, most famous thing in psychology. This would be the DSM test, where you can actually take someone you've never met. You can give them a battery of tests to decide how they fit and integrate into the group and how effective they are by virtue of the assumption that there's a standardized behavior pattern that fits the human species. Anthropologists and geographers don't buy this, but it underlies psychology, and especially psychiatry. It's based entirely on psychic unity, that there's some sort of a norm, and deviation from the norm is subject to whatever. And again, this is a peculiarly Western thing. It is not part of other intellectual traditions. So in Asia, again, the Pacific, Native American groups don't have psychic unity. So that means the idea of stranger is radically different, because you don't assume strangers see or experience or even think the same way that you do, versus the Western tradition, where it's the assumption they should, which then, of course, gets us back into ethnocentrism. So a set of related concepts, they are central to the way that the Western system functions. Just be aware that they are a reflection of the bias that underlies Western thought, and they are what they are. So just accept them. That's not the purpose of this class to get rid of them. You can't. But again, the sensitivity and the awareness that you have these concepts is what we're looking for here.